So I would now like to introduce Professor Leila Farsakh. And to do that, just for the purposes of taping, I'm going to again welcome all of you to this event and ask Leila Farsakh from UMass Boston, her bio is in your packet, to ascend to this space, the pulpit. We're speaking up here, by the way, because the mic is just much better than the handheld mics. So Leila, who will be serving as our MC for the day, and will make introductory remarks now about this conference. Leila.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I will start really by specifically thanking Nancy Murray and Elaine Hagobian, because without them, this conference could not have taken place. I really want to ask you all to just give them a clap of applause. Their vision, their perseverance, and their commitment to Palestine and to issues of justice has always moved me and been a source of inspiration for many people of my generation and also younger. So thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you all for being here. As you know, the aim of this conference is to discuss the legacy of the Balfour Declaration, which was issued by Britain exactly 100 years ago on the 2nd of November 1917. This small paragraph of 67 words, as you know, has given the national Zionist movement the right to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. It is a declaration that had major consequences not only on the indigenous people of the land, the Palestinians, but also on what is called the Jewish question, namely the issue of anti-Semitism in the West and the concept of what constitutes a people, a nation, and what about citizens' rights. It has also been a declaration that sowed the seed of one of the longest and intractable conflicts of the 20th and the 21st century, namely the Palestinian conflict. One that is far from being resolved, despite the fact that next year we commemorate 70 years of the Nakba, or the creation of the State of Israel, 50 years of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and 25 years nearly of Oslo peace process that failed so far to bring any peace. So what this conference seeks to do is to shed new light on how this Balfour Declaration has been important, why reviewing it today is necessary, and what implications it has still today on the domestic, regional, and international level. In my view, and I think what various speakers would try to show you today, is that reviewing this Balfour Declaration today is important because it helps us in three main things. It helps us to re-examine and understand what this conflict is about and why it has lasted so long. Secondly, it helps us to rethink the nation state and the two-state solution as a possible venue for peace. And thirdly, it makes us rethink the kind of actor and strategies needed to achieve peace in Israel and Palestine, as well as outside it. So with regards to how the Balfour Declaration and confronting the consequences entails, I think the first thing reconsidering the Balfour Declaration is important is because it reminds us that this conflict is a settler colonial conflict. The declaration created a settler colonial reality in Palestine. As the word of, and I'm going to just read the 67 words, which are actually quite phenomenal in how they impacted the history of the region. It says it was a letter from the British Foreign Secretary in 1917, Lord Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, who is the representative of the Zionist movement at the time. It says, and here I'm quoting, that Her Majesty views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done that may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This declaration thus set a settler colonial reality in Palestine in the fact, in many ways. First, that it acknowledged the Zionist movement, which was fundamentally an Ashkenazi Western nationalist movement, as a representative of the Jewish people. It also made clear that it prioritized the political right of European Jewish immigrants over the indigenous population, namely the Palestinians. The Balfour Declaration also gives the Jewish people a term that it does not define and which is much contested by Jews and others, the right to self-determination at the same time as ensuring their rights as citizens in other countries. It denies this right to self-determination to the Palestinians or the indigenous population. It only gives them civil and religious rights, reflecting thereby an imperial racial attitude towards natives assumed not to exist or not to merit equality and political agency. Meanwhile, the Balfour Declaration also reveals that from its outset has implicated international actors. It shows us that this conflict has always had imperial sponsors, first Britain, today many would argue the United States, and it always had international culprits, namely the League of Nations, which incorporated the Balfour Declaration in the British Mandate of Palestine, and also today with the United Nations, whose various resolutions have been central to defining how this conflict is to be resolved or not resolved. So, seen from the perspective of the Palestinian people, the Balfour Declaration is a proclamation of war on them. This war was waged over the next decades by Zionist movement with money, legal means and propaganda, with the support of the British Empire and then afterwards with the US support. Reviewing the Balfour Declaration today helps us to understand that the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, did not start in 1948 or in 1967. It started in 1917. And it has not only the Palestinian and the Israeli involved, it also has international powers and UN agency, superpowers as well, and local societies. One would also argue that the Balfour Declaration was an assault on the Jewish people, specifically those living in the Middle East, but not only. We know today how old and large Jewish communities in the Middle East, in Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, Morocco, were opposed to the Balfour Declaration and saw their lives linked with Arab neighbors, not with Ashkenazi Western Jews. The creation of Israel complicated rather than harmed the diversity of the Jewish people, their link to the Middle East, as well as Jews outside of Palestine. It also changed the character and shape of the Middle East in ways that led to polarizations we're still living with today. Fourthly, reflecting on the Balfour Declaration helps us to examine the notion of the state and the nation state as a solution or protector of people's right. It reminds us that the conflict is not about religion, but about land. It is about political rights and the extent to which the nation state can be protector or usurper of these rights. The declaration, of course, does not talk about a state. It promised the creation of a national home for the Jewish people, not a state. A national home can take various forms, of course. It can be an autonomy, it can be a self-government, it can be a state in the American sense of a state, the way that Massachusetts, for example, is a state in a federal structure of the United States of America. And many humanist Zionist thinkers like Martin Buber and Yehuda Magnus have indeed pushed for the argument that the Jews do not need a state in Palestine, they are a nation, and the solution in Palestine should be a binational state. Yet the vagueness of the Balfour Declaration with regards to what a national home meant is key to understanding the problem, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the continuity of this conflict, but also how we can rethink the solution to this conflict. It shows us that the question of collective and individual rights of any person living in Palestine needs to be considered and thought of how it can be protected. The 20th century concept of self-determination sought in the nation-state the political means to protect collective and individual rights. This is why the Zionist movement, since Herzl, wanted to create a state for the Jewish people, and why the Palestinians, by 1971, called for the establishment of a Palestinian state, and by 1988 accepted the two-state solution as the only way to give Palestinian political rights. However, the nation-state, as Hannah Arendt and others already demonstrated, also robs the people who do not belong to the nation of their political right. The nation-state is bound to create refugees, people with no rights to have rights, as she called it, as was well exemplified in Palestine in 1948 with the creation of Israel, and also as happened before already in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. The Palestinian refugee problem remains today one of the oldest and largest problems in the Middle East, that no nation-state or two-state solution have been able to resolve. Last but not least, reflecting on the Balfour Declarations helps us to see that no solution can be obtained for two communities fighting over the same piece of land without addressing the root cause of the problem, namely the settler colonial reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It brings us back to the question of political rights of those who live in the land and how to honor them rather than deny one group in favor of another under the auspice of a two-state, one state, or however number of states. Reflecting on the Balfour Declaration and considering its consequences, asks from us to rethink how we can find a solution that is based on reconciliation that acknowledges historical realities rather than ignore them, and calls for us to think about how we can find a genuine compromise that is based on justice and equality, not on imposition of the will of the stronger over the weaker. It also highlights to us the various actors involved in the conflict, not simply the Palestinians and the Israelis, but also the international organizations and the local communities, UN agencies, and local activists. I think we are very lucky today that we have such prominent and important speakers who have worked a lot on this conflict and who can help us shed light and understand the meaning and implications of the Balfour Declaration in its various dimensions. Above all, they will also help the peculiarity and speciality of this, uniqueness of this conference, and why I would thank very much Nancy for it, on her insistence that we also try to have, we're having workshop this afternoon in order to address together in various workshops how to address the injustices created over the past 100 years and find strategies and actions for everybody to try and move towards peace. Thank you very much, and please, I'm going to ask the second panelist, the first panelist, to come to the platform. The first panel we're going to have, it's about Balfour, Israel, and Palestine, and we're going to have three speakers, and Hilary Rantisi will be facilitating.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming at this early hour on a weekend, and a cold weekend for that. So I really appreciate your presence here. I want to thank the organizers as well, and especially Nancy Murray and Elaine Hagopian for their hard work, their vision, and their leadership in our community here. I'm honored to chair this panel of distinguished speakers at this very important conference. As we reflect on the consequences of the Balfour Declaration, we must recognize that the racist, colonial, and arrogant mindset that brought it about 100 years ago and allowed for the establishment of a settler colonial state on the land of Palestine dispossessed many Palestinians, including my entire family, and violently uprooted and placed them in a purgatory for the rest of their lives, whereby they were stateless, landless, and repeatedly had their history and culture erased. This same mindset continues today, as do the countless injustices suffered by the Palestinians. This is why this conference is important. This is not just a history of what happened 100 years ago, but the consequences that continue to this day. And I look forward to hearing all the various presentations we will be hearing today from different perspectives. With my brief remarks here, I will start with very brief introductions, as the bios are in the programs you have. But since this is the first panel of the conference, I ask that you help me to keep this on track, and so that we can hear everyone and have time for discussion. First, we have Lawrence Davidson, a professor emeritus of history at Westchester University, speaking, followed by Susan Akram, professor of international law at Boston University and director of International Human Rights Clinic at Boston University, and finally Tom Suárez, faculty member of Palestine's National Conservatory of Music and author of several books, and he will also be signing his book over the lunch break. So please join me in welcoming our guest panelists for this morning. Professor Davidson, if you could join me upstairs.
So the title of my brief talk is Balfour and the Zionist Project. I want to begin with a series of statements. Let's imagine that Balfour is here, and we'll make a series of statements to him, and what these statements will do is affirm without hesitation that he agrees to what we're saying. Okay? So the first statement is that Britain in 1917 is an imperialist empire, and if she and her allies win in the First World War, that Britain would quickly expand its empire, particularly in the Middle East. Balfour would agree with this statement without hesitation. Second, if we asserted that the Arab and other indigenous peoples of the Middle East were less civilized and less politically capable than Europeans, who at that time were bent on slaughtering each other, but that's an aside, Balfour would agree with this. And he would say that because the non-European peoples of the Middle East were less capable, that they could rightly be put under European imperial or colonial sway. Third, if we then suggested, perhaps lowering our voice a bit here, that the wealthier elements of European Jewry exercised worldwide financial and political influence that could be used to help Britain and her allies win the war, Balfour would agree with that too. And of course, it would be based on that belief that he would make his declarative promise to support the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine in return for Jewish wartime assistance. Then, perhaps after a solemn silence, we asserted to Balfour that the Old Testament Bible certainly held literal truths. Among them, the prophecy that the Jewish people would be one day returned to their promised land of Israel. Balfour would again agree with this without hesitation. And in this regard, Balfour, as well as Prime Minister Lloyd George, Prime Minister of England at the time, would see themselves as playing a role in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy by assisting the return of the Jewish people to the modern site of ancient Israel, which was Palestine. And it should be noticed that Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, would see himself in the same light. So we have three men of particular importance and national leadership: Prime Minister of England, the Foreign Minister of England, and the President of the United States, all who believed in biblical prophecy and saw themselves as playing a role in it. So against Balfour's dedication to the expansion of empire, this illusionary assumption of Jewish world influence, and his religious faith in the Old Testament prophecies, the fate of the Palestinian Arabs weighed very little. In fact, on August 11th, 1919, Balfour wrote a memo to the Foreign Office, and in it he said, quote, "Zionism is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs and future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabited that ancient land," unquote. And just also as an aside, it's ironic, there were only two members of the War Cabinet, the British War Cabinet, who raised any objections to the Balfour Declaration based on consideration of the native population, of the Arab population of Palestine, which were then referred to as Muslim. Ironically, one of those was Jan Smuts of South Africa, and the other was the Jewish Lord Edwin Montagu. Okay. Now, moving on, let's make a series of statements that Chaim Weizmann, who Balfour is working with at this time, and other leaders of the World Zionist Organization would agree to without hesitation. Okay? And these will be familiar, but they set up the scenario for my conclusions. One is that a Jewish state is the only plausible answer to the problem of European anti-Semitism. And since European Jews were the victims of this anti-Semitism, whatever state would be created would have to be populated and controlled by European Jews. This was the so-called Zionist project. And Chaim Weizmann, it was a complete agreement, obviously, and he was at the forefront of trying to create this and bring this project to fruition. Now, it is to be noted that the political Zionists, like Weizmann, gave almost no thought. In fact, I could find no actual reference in the documents at all to Sephardic Jews of the Near East, or the significance of centuries of relative peaceful coexistence between Sephardic Jews and the Arabs. They were simply not referenced. Okay? The second statement would be that Jews of Zionist persuasion were, by 1917, agreed that Palestine, the site of ancient Israel, was the only acceptable site for such a state. And thirdly, the non-Jewish population in Palestine, native population, was of no more consequence to Zionist Jews than they were to the imperially minded British. The reason for that is because these Jews were, despite anti-Semitism, of a European mindset, and thus partook of the essentially racist view of non-Europeans at the time. In this regard, on January 19th, 1943, in a meeting with the Near East Department, Subdepartment of the State Department, Chaim Weizmann stated categorically that, quote, Palestine can never be an Arab land again. And finally, Weizmann would agree with the statement that in the attempt to found a Jewish state in Palestine, an alliance with an expansionist imperial state was a reasonable tactical step. And Great Britain, rather than Germany, was the logical partner. This is because Germany was allied to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was, before the British came in control of Palestine. So it's to be noted that these statements, to which Balfour and Weizmann both would agree, reflected unquestioned assumptions, which in turn supported the main traits of imperialism as practiced before World War II. And these were, briefly, a sense of superiority of European civilization, a sense of possessing a superior religion, Christianity or Judaism, a racist attitude towards non-Europeans, and a willingness to ignore the rights of alleged inferiors. Now today, most of us, particularly here, but most of us, understand that these assumptions are both factually and morally indefensible, and their consequences should be addressed and remedied. But Balfour and Weizmann were living at a time where that particular modern attitude made no sense to them at all. Nonetheless, to the extent that modern people share now this sense of moral repulsion, the world has really changed. And today we can say we live in a post-colonial era wherein imperialism is thought of as a negative thing of the past. This means that both the Balfour Declaration and the Zionist Project are really anachronisms, things of the past, much like white South Africa was. They are all products of a pre-World War II colonial era. And this leads us to another really seminal consequence. For Israel today to be truly accepted into the modern world, one of two things must happen. Either Israel must give up its racist ideology of Zionism, or the world must revert back to an acceptance of at least some of the colonial practices of the 19th century. Now, you would think that choosing the anti-racist option, and therefore seriously pressuring Israel, as it was done to South Africa, to fundamentally change, would be the obvious choice for today's statesmen. But it's not. It's not the obvious choice for them. There is an ongoing effort, we might call it the updated Zionist project, to move the world backward so as to accept racist past practices. It constitutes an attack on international law that seeks to protect and promote human rights, despite the fact that the origin of much of that international law comes as a reaction to Nazi persecution of Jews in World War II. Doesn't matter. There is an attack on that kind of international law, and an attack on the objectivity and efficacy of the United Nations, also in the area of protection of human rights. It was war and racism that brought the two imperial entities, the British Empire and the World Zionist Organization, together. And it is war and continued justification of racism by which Israel maintains its survival in our own day. The question for all of us is just how far we want to turn the clock back, or essentially we have to organize ourselves to promote the first option, which is that Israel can no longer be a Zionist state, quoting, sort of paraphrasing Weitzman, rather than the world go back to colonial practices. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite Professor Susan Akram to come up here.
Thank you for coming out in such a freezing cold morning. This is truly the gathering of stalwarts. And in my not so brief remarks, I'm afraid, I actually want to challenge the received wisdom about Balfour and discuss the question of nationality with regard to Palestinians, the claim of Jewish nationality, and compare Palestinian nationality with the claim of Jewish nationality and self-determination rights of the two peoples in the context of both peoples' territorial claims and as these are affected by Balfour, or were affected by Balfour. And it's important at the outset to define the meaning of the terms citizen and national. They're often used interchangeably, but such usage confuses their distinct legal meaning in many contexts. Moreover, nationality has a legal and a sociological meaning, and the sociological is more commonly understood than the legal. In the latter sense, nationality is taken to mean ethno-national identity, the identification with a particular group considered to have common ethnic origins, Bosnians or Serbs, Kurds, Tamils, or Armenians, regardless of the territory in which they're located. The legal meaning, however, is quite different and refers to the relationship as defined by law between an individual and a particular state or territory. Under classical international law theory, nationality determined which state a person belonged to for purposes of disputes with other states, such as for diplomatic intervention. Since nationality is, and I quote the language of the International Court, the link between the individual and international law, it is critical to determine who is a national of a state or a territory, and hence what rights in and to that territory the individual has as a matter of international law. From the legal perspective, the ethno-national identity of a person is irrelevant, as it is the connection the person has to a particular state or territory, that is, his membership in it, which defines his legal nationality. The term citizen is mostly of significance as a matter of the domestic law of states. That is, a state can determine through its internal laws which among its residents have the preferred status of citizenship. With the particular privileges and benefits afforded by that status. Although in classical international law terms the nationality of a person is determined vis-a-vis international law and citizenship by domestic law, the distinction between the two has become less significant with the growing importance of human rights law. In the Palestine case, however, and indeed in most of the Arab world, the distinction between the two remains both relevant and critical. So I'll start with Palestinian nationality. The argument that Palestinians have a recognized nationality begins with the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire from 1516 until 1923. Various changes occurred to the territory, none of which are really important to our nationality question, until the Treaty of Lausanne on 24 July 1923. On 6 August 1924, under the terms of the Lausanne Treaty, Ottoman citizens who resided in the territory of Palestine became Palestinian citizens. As a matter of international law, Palestinian nationality was formed on this date. The Lausanne Treaty also created separate territories, fixed borders, and established separate nationalities for Transjordan, Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon. Following the Lausanne Treaty, each of these territories, including Palestine, had a citizenship law that codified their nationality status. Under British mandate, during the League of Nations period from 1922 until 1948, Palestinian citizenship was codified by British law, the Palestinian Citizenship Order of 1925, which included the acquisition of Palestinian citizenship through birth in Palestine, primarily. Under the mandate system, the local people were not nationals of the mandate powers, although they could obtain diplomatic protection from the mandate country. The Palestine Citizenship Order afforded Palestinian citizenship to all those who were Turkish subjects or citizens at the time of the Lausanne Treaty and were habitually resident in Palestine. The population meeting this criteria numbered 847,000 people. These included, however, certain foreign residents who immigrated to Palestine between 1920 and 1922, mostly immigrant Jews. By proclamation of September 1922, the British government provided that any person of other than Ottoman nationality, habitually resident in Palestine on that date, might apply for Palestinian citizenship. Approximately 38,000 people were granted Palestine citizenship under that proclamation, mostly Jews. Thus far, aside from the complication of the British mandate itself and the inclusion of the terms of the Balfour Declaration in it, which I'll come to later, the recognition and codification of Palestinian nationality was consistent with international law. It attached to a population that was genuinely and intrinsically linked to a defined territory with specified borders and was passed through blood, residence, or birth on the territory. It was also consistent with the customary law rule that inhabitants found on a territory when there's a change of sovereignty should automatically acquire the nationality of the successor state. The British citizenship law even granting status to immigrants, was generally consistent with these rules. Under the British citizenship law, Palestinians could obtain passports, and over 70,000 Palestinian passports were issued. So now we come to the Balfour Declaration and what it had to do with the nationality question. By 1901, the World Zionist Organization had established the Jewish National Fund to purchase land for Jewish settlers in Palestine, as well as in other areas in the Middle East and Africa. Theodor Herzl and the WZO envisioned the Zionist project of redeeming the land for Jews as taking land from the Arabs and expelling them from Palestine. The Zionists succeeded, as you heard from Lawrence Davidson, in aligning their plan with British interests in the Middle East. And in 1917, the British cabinet endorsed the letter that became known as the Balfour Declaration. Leila Farsakh read the letter. I won't read it again, but simply to point out a few issues about it. The Zionists interpreted the endorsement of the Declaration of Balfour as a British commitment to the Jewish people for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. First, Britain had no legal authority to create any political entity in Palestine that disregarded the rights of the indigenous Palestinian population, a fact that's actually recognized in the declaration itself. Second, such an interpretation violated the agreement made between the British government and Arab leaders during World War I that guaranteed the independence of the Arabs in all the regions under authority of the Sharif of Mecca once the war had ended, that indisputably included Palestine, as even the British Foreign Office maps showed. Third, there was no legal concept of the Jewish people as a political entity with recognized rights separate from the religious or cultural identity of the Jewish people. Fourth, the history of the Balfour Declaration reflects that the British government itself did not believe that the Zionists represented the rights or interests of the Jewish people. Anti-Zionist Jews, particularly prominent political leaders such as Lord Montagu, made it clear to the British government that the Zionists did not represent British Jews, let alone world Jewry. Most important, the British Parliament neither endorsed the Balfour Declaration nor passed it. It was defeated in both houses when put to a parliamentary vote. The only consistent interpretation of the Balfour Declaration with the negotiations and drafting history, Britain's pre-existing obligations under the League of Nations Charter, the mandate and its provision on minority treaties, and with existing international law was that Britain intended to provide for Jews a home in Palestine, but not a homeland, not a Jewish state. In other words, Britain recognized repeatedly in government letters, statements, and actions that it intended to provide a sanctuary for Jews in Palestine without violating the rights of Palestinian Arabs or the rights of Jews in any other country in the world. Nothing in the historical or legal history gives support for a claim that the Balfour Declaration recognized Jewish nationality attached to a distinct population of individuals entitled to self-determination in Palestine. Next, we come to Resolution 181 and the nationality question. This is the next major legal historical development relevant to the question of nationality, and that is Resolution 181, the partition plan of 29 November 1947. First, it's important to note that 181 was a General Assembly resolution, not a Security Council resolution. And under the UN Charter, the General Assembly has no authority to divide territory or to enforce any kind of obligation on states or people. The resolution language itself begins with the General Assembly recommends. The United Nations as a whole recognized this, as after passage of 181, both the Security Council and Britain, the mandatory power, refused to enforce the partition plan. The UN Secretariat issued an interpretation stating that Resolution 181 has no obligatory character whatsoever. The attempt to take the issue of the legality of 181 to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion was narrowly defeated by states strong-armed by the US and Israel to defeat the effort. Second, it's important to understand the actual provisions of 181. In terms of nationalities, it is true that the British had separated Jewish from Arab nationalities in Palestine in incorporating the Balfour Declaration into the mandate and in granting citizenship to Jews who had entered and remained illegally. Still, the Jews given citizenship were those actually residing in Palestine, not outside. 181's recognition of a Jewish and an Arab state did refer to religious and racial criteria to identify territorial division, but referred to them as the two peoples of Palestine. The plan stated that Palestinian citizens residing in Palestine, as well as the Arabs and Jews, who, not holding Palestinian citizenship, reside in Palestine, shall, upon the recognition of independence, become citizens of the state in which they are resident and enjoy full civil and political rights. This requires careful note. The plan's principle was that Palestinian citizens, regardless of their religion, residing in the Arab state, would become citizens of the Arab state. Palestinian citizens residing in the Jewish state, regardless of their religion, would become citizens of the Jewish state. Moreover, the population demographics on which the partition plan was based were incorrect because they excluded the Arab Bedouins. The British Palestine authorities telegrammed a serious omission to the British Foreign Office upon release of the plan for partition. It's important enough to quote. It said, "The immediately striking feature of the plan is that on the committee's own figures, including 90,000 Bedouins, the Jewish state would contain more Arabs than Jews. The Arab population is larger than any the plan has seriously propounded." Finally, the resolution required a one-year period prior to recognition of independence of either state, during which time both states had to incorporate constitutions that provided for equal rights for all citizens with no discrimination. Thus, the partition plan did not authorize either state to institutionalize superior rights for any religious or racial group. Aside from recommending partition of territory that was not within its authority, the General Assembly's plan of how division was to be made, that is, on the basis of habitual residents and citizens already on each territory, was on its terms consistent with international law. It preserved Palestinian nationality stemming from the Lausanne Treaty and the British citizenship laws of Palestine. Nothing in Resolution 181 gives support for a claim of Jewish nationality other than those Jews habitually resident in Palestine, eligible for Palestinian citizenship living on the territory. There's several other documents I don't really have time to go through. Resolution 194 has something to say about the nationality issue and Israeli citizenship nationality law. But let me end with talking about the Jewish claims of nationality. Is there a Jewish nationality? Israel granted two-tiered citizenship under its nationality law after it became a state, but that must also be scrutinized for conformance with international law. Israeli nationality law created a legal fiction. There's no such thing as Israeli nationality, as the Israeli High Court itself has confirmed. Israeli law, official institutions, or records do not recognize an Israeli nationality status. Israel's Interior Ministry lists over 100 nationality. No Israeli nationality is listed. The only nationality to which rights and privileges are attached is Jewish nationality. Jewish claims of nationality and self-determination must be clearly distinguished from the claims of Israeli Jews to nationality and self-determination as a matter of international law. Israel proclaimed her state on behalf of the Jewish people, a concept which, until today, grants rights to and within the state on an extraterritorial basis. When it enacted its citizenship law in 1950, it granted nationality, as I said, to Jews only, repealing the Palestine citizenship law passed by Britain. The people entitled to national status in the Jewish state, defined under the partition resolution, included both Jews and Palestinians already residing in the territory, all of whom were to be granted equal rights under a constitution to be enforced in both states prior to UN recognition. So what is the status of Palestinian nationality today, and what relevance does it have to our question? On the one hand, there's an argument that Palestinians continue to retain Palestinian nationality to the present. This is based on the historical and legal facts I've described, and that Israel's revocation of Palestinian citizenship and denaturalization of Palestinians was illegal, and its denial of Palestinian return is also illegal. The argument rests on the claim that Israel's acts, being illegal, do not affect Palestinian nationality as a matter of international law, and that nationality remains unbroken despite the inability of the majority of Palestinians to return to their homes. And I'll end with the argument that Palestinians lost their nationality in 1948, and those unable to meet the criteria of Israel's law of nationality having become stateless. My contention is that this is a weaker argument, both legally and in terms of its consequences for Palestinians and Palestinian refugees, in particular with regard to the right of return. In the Western states, this is marginally helpful, that is, designating Palestinians as stateless, because there have been no advantages to Palestinians from that definition. It's my contention that Palestinians have been right in maintaining that their Palestinian nationality remains intact today, that they are not stateless, and their right of return is based squarely on their rights as nationals of Palestine, not just as refugees. Moreover, there's no parallel legal authority, whether in the Balfour Declaration, in 181, in 194, or any subsequent resolutions, for a claim of Jewish nationality that negates Palestine national rights. Advocacy on right of return for Palestinians as nationals, not as stateless persons, and not just as refugees, should be clearly framed around the language and principles underlying Resolution 181, Resolution 194, and the illegality of Israel's so-called nationality law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to invite our last speaker, Tom Suárez, to come up.
Thank you so much, everyone. This good like this? Quickly, I'd like to mention an extremely important book, Palestine, the Reality, which was written by a journalist at the time, published in 1940. Most copies were destroyed in the German Blitz. It has now been newly republished and is available here, thanks to Interlink Books. The Balfour Declaration unleashed a campaign of Zionist terrorism that is shockingly at odds with the prevailing narrative of Israel's birth, and more to the point, the very nature of Zionism. This history is not in question. It is preserved in British source documents, in mainstream media of the day, and in Zionist records. Today's tragedy in Israel-Palestine cannot be detached from this history of terrorism because the so-called conflict is that ongoing history. Balfour's legacy typically conjures images of the dispossession of non-Jewish Palestinians. Missing from this snapshot is the parallel violence against Jews that Balfour's signature set loose. Like its violence against the Palestinians, Zionism's anti-Jewish violence took two forms: physical violence and dehumanization, what one might call spiritual violence. For both peoples, the physical violence was to force mass human migration, just as Palestinians could not be removed from the land except by violence against them. Zionism could not install a critical mass of Jews in their place without violence against Jews. For Palestinians, this was ethnic cleansing and massacres, as well as starving them off the land by expropriating all means of livelihood. For Jews, the violence was more camouflaged. Its principal forms were the blocking of any safe haven outside of Palestine, manufactured violence to force the uprooting of Jews living elsewhere in peace, and the indoctrination of Jewish DPs, displaced people, and children into Zionist messianic fundamentalism. But all this is violence against civilians to force a political goal. That is to say, the Zionist project itself is by its very nature one of terrorism. And so Zionism needed two antidotes. One, it needed to reframe its terrorism as defense, which it accomplished by dehumanizing the Palestinians, the obstacle to its settler state, into an eternal threat, irredeemably violent as a race. And two, it needed extraordinary impunity, for which it dehumanized Jews, the means to its settler state. Zionism achieved this impunity by dehumanizing Jews into the settler state itself. Israel acts as the very embodiment of Jews, Jewish history, culture, and persecution, expropriating these and all they symbolize back to the Jewish kingdoms cited in the Old Testament, of which it claims to be the rebirth. And it reinforces this messianic facade by expropriating relevant archaeological artifacts as artifacts of the nation-state's history. In closed discussions, Ben-Gurion made no pretense about the cynicism of this. The reason they would call their state Israel, he said, was to get Jews to go there. It was brilliant marketing, and the military value of this is staggering, reducing Jewry to a human shield for the settler state, and enabling Israel to frame criticism of it as criticism of Jews themselves, thus making criticism anti-Semitic by definition. But inescapably, this means that all Jews, simply because they are Jews, are then guilty of whatever the Israeli state does. Thus, Zionism, if we accept it, succeeds where all the bigots through the centuries never could. If we accept it, Zionism corrupts Jewry itself from within. And so the oft-heard question, does anti-Zionism necessarily equal anti-Semitism, is backwards. The question should be, is Zionism necessarily anti-Semitic? The Zionist cause was always held sacrosanct above all else, even during World War II and even when it frustrated the Allies' war efforts. And with the Allied victory, Zionism continued to claim its tribal, extra-national ownership over the war's Jewish survivors. It did not matter what, given the honest opportunity, the survivors might have wished for themselves as their individual self-determination. They were segregated from non-Jewish survivors and put into Zionist-run camps that were nothing short of indoctrination factories, tolerating no deviance from Zionist orthodoxy. Opportunities for hundreds of thousands of new homes in safe countries, like the United States and Britain, were sabotaged by Zionist leaders who needed the DPs to populate their settler state. A kidnapping campaign was waged to remove children of Jewish background from their adoptive European families because Zionism needed the children as facts on the ground. European Jewish children still in the camps were blocked from new homes, even new Jewish homes, if those homes were not in Palestine. Propaganda events, most famously the vessel Exodus, were staged at the expense of the welfare of Jewish survivors who were turned into sympathy victims and then forgotten once the theater was over. Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa were subjected to scare propaganda and false flag terrorism to ethnically cleanse Jews from their homelands to become second-class ethnic fodder in Israel. And when, in the 1980s, Jews were able to leave Russia and emigrate to the United States, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, former bigwig of the terror gang Lehi, successfully coerced U.S. President Reagan to close U.S. doors to them. It is consummate irony, then, that Zionism is now being flaunted as Jewish self-determination. It is exactly the opposite. It is the hijacking of that individual self-identity and self-determination, and the hijacking of that individual self-identity and self-determination by a political project that has been the cause of a century of misery, displacement, and death. Balfour and the other officials responsible knew in 1917, knew all along, that the declaration's polite phrase about no harm coming to the Palestinians was a lie. It was never a failure of good intentions. And as the years passed, the determination to seize and ethnically cleanse Palestine remained the explicit plan of the top Zionist leaders, Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, etc. Balfour lived long enough to see his signature translate into Zionist anti-Jewish violence. By 1924, the allegedly defensive Haganah, what would become the Israeli military, was already assassinating Jews for their opposition to Zionism. But Balfour did not live quite long enough to lose hope that the Zionists would double as surrogate empire builders for Britain. Rather, Zionist terrorism continued through World War II and by 1946 was tearing Palestine apart as the Palestinians maintained stoic nonviolence. Anyone or anything that kept Palestine a functioning society was a target of the Zionists. Trains, roads, bridges, communications, oil facilities, and Coast Guard stations were constantly being bombed. Soldiers, utility workers, telephone repairmen, railway workers, bomb disposal personnel, anyone coming forward to help stop the terror were murdered. Police, and especially Jewish police, were long a favored target of the Zionists and were gunned down by the dozens. That Jewish children were indoctrinated and exploited was obvious at least as early as 1938, when the British caught the bomber of a Palestinian bus. She was 12 years old, egged on by 3 adults. Teenagers were commonly used for terror attacks, and those who resisted involvement in the militias were blocked from advancement in school. Among the smaller terror organizations that popped up was one specifically dedicated to preventing Jews from befriending non-Jews, the ultimate fear, of course, being polluting what for the Zionists was the pure Jewish race. As a sample of its methods, the terror group doused a disobedient Jewish girl with acid, severely injuring her and blinding her in one eye. Illustrative of the degree to which Zionist plans infiltrated the government in everyday life, a couple of months after one Coast Guard station was attacked and bombed by the Haganah, it blew up again, but the British were baffled because this time there had been no attack. It just blew up. They discovered that the construction crew that had rebuilt the station after the previous attack were Haganah and had simply embedded explosives in the reconstruction. But the worst problem of infiltration was in the military service, where deadly sabotage by Zionist plans who had joined the forces led, tragically, to orders to remove all Jews from service in Palestine because there was no way to tell them from the Zionists. By 1948, this problem spread to key medical personnel. After the Jewish agency poisoned the water supply of Acre with typhoid in order to expedite the ethnic cleansing of this city that lies on the Palestinian side of partition, the bacteriologist hired by the British proved to be a Haganah plant or sympathizer, an obstacle to the availability of the vaccine. Nor did Balfour live long enough to see his signature spread terrorism to Europe and Britain. His own embassy in Rome bombed. Allied trains in Austria bombed. Government buildings in London bombed. And a concerted, though almost entirely unsuccessful, campaign of letter bombs. 30 years and 27 days after Balfour signed his name, the UN capitulated to Zionist terrorism and passed UN Resolution 181 with its implicit creation of the Israeli state. The alternate UN plan was for a binational state, but this compromise would be, to quote British documents, totally unacceptable to the Zionists and, quote, would therefore be followed by an intensification of Jewish terrorism. That is, yet greater terrorism over that which had already brought Palestine to its knees. The disproportionately large land area the UN gave the Zionists in Resolution 181 was also a capitulation to Zionist terrorism. Again, quoting British sources, giving the Zionists so much land up front was an attempt to delay, not prevent, but merely delay the Zionist expansionist wars that they knew would come. But this appeasement, of course, failed because within a few months of Resolution 181, the Zionist militias were already waging their first expansionist war, confiscating more than half of the Palestinian side of partition. In the words of the High Commissioner at the time, the Zionists were jubilant with their campaign of calculated aggression coupled with brutality, the mortaring of terrified women and children. And the Zionist persecution of Jews who displeased them has, quote, reached medieval standards. The armistice that ended the 1948 war established a ceasefire line, essentially what would become known as the 67 borders, that, to quote from the agreement, is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. Israel was supposed to return to the agreed partition or other mutually agreed alternative, but it simply refused. Even if one accepts the legality of partition, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land began then, in 1948, not in 1967. Fast forward to today, and what is the living legacy of Britain's arrogance in giving away other people's land? Generations of people are condemned to life in camps because they are the wrong ethnicity. People live under a ruthless military occupation because they are the wrong ethnicity. And Gaza has been reduced to a laboratory for sadism and weapons proving. Were Balfour to be alive today, perhaps what for him would be the greatest irony is how his living declaration now corrupts British politics and censors speech and debate in Britain on behalf of the foreign state his signature helped jumpstart. The conflict could end tomorrow if the complicit nations, the United States, Britain, and the various European countries, stop enabling it. And lest this claim seem exaggerated, just imagine for a moment how the international community would react if the ethnicities in this so-called conflict were reversed. If the ethnicities were reversed, the international community would rush their militaries to the region to stop precisely what it now empowers and finances. It would suddenly demand an immediate end to race laws and apartheid and the creation of a secular democratic state of equals. And the international community would jump to proclaim that equality, obviously, means the unqualified right of return. It would suddenly be self-evident that you can't ethnically cleanse people and then say that equality does not apply to them because they're not present. The British government's refusal to acknowledge the sins of its predecessors is disgraceful, but it is the United States that since the mid-1940s has been the principal torchbearer of the Balfour Declaration, and so as Americans, it is our moral responsibility to make it history. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our three presenters for very rich presentations. And we have some time for questions now. I ask that you please, those who have questions, come up to the microphone and we can have a starter line. I ask that you please introduce yourself and keep your remark to a question. That means have a question mark at the end of your sentence and keep it short so that we can get as many questions as possible. I also want to thank our presenters for keeping to time. So we will have a nice, rich discussion now, time for question and answer before a coffee break. So please, we'll start with Don. If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Don McInnes, and I'm a lawyer, and I resent the imposition of this short time to introduce myself, etc. But anyway, I'll do the best I can. You have made a big case for the large influence of the Balfour Declaration. But my question is, suppose there had been no Balfour Declaration. Would today's circumstances be significantly different? And my own opinion is no, but I'd like to hear your opinion.
why did this, is this on? Yes? Why did the Zionists need the British? It happened to be the British, but it could have been any major Western power would have done the same thing. It needed them to put them on the map, so to speak, as this legitimate movement, and it needed them to put down the indigenous resistance before they were able to do so themselves, and ultimately, it needed the British colonial establishment so that the Zionists could position themselves as a liberation movement. It couldn't position themselves as a liberation movement against the Palestinians, but it needed this colonial enterprise for them to, quote unquote, liberate themselves from. So I think, yes, it needed the Balfour Declaration, or it needed something to serve these three purposes. That's my view on that.
Maybe I'll just add that it's not per se the Balfour Declaration, but the desire on the part of the British government at the time to, one, recruit what they assumed was a very wealthy world Jewry to their side in the war, number one, and two, to deal with the quote-unquote Jewish question in a way that wouldn't bring the Jews to Europe or the United States. Those were, I think, the two major factors, and whether or not Balfour was there, as long as that desire was there and found comrades in those two major missions, it was going to happen.
Well, then I think you're saying that, yes, if there had been no Balfour Declaration, today's circumstances would be significantly different. That's what you're telling me.
I think they said another declaration probably would be created. So, second question.
Leila Cable. Two things is, don't know if it's a question, I don't think it's a question. The Soviet Union that was established also was not opposed to the establishment of the state of Israel as we see it today. As a matter of fact, they recognized it right away. The one thing that wasn't brought up, they were excellent speeches, all of them. I just read this somewhere, how the US Jews pushed for the entry of the US into World War I in return for the Balfour Declaration. I don't know if it's exactly true, but the day the 60,000 British soldiers were killed on the war front, Britain was desperate, and the US Jews, Brandeis being very effective in that, said, we will guarantee US entry into the war if you give us what we want. I'm not sure if it's true or not.
Yeah, I mean, Weitzman implied in fact, he stated to Balfour that the World Zionist Organization represented millions and millions of Jews, which was, let's put it this way, an exaggeration. He also implied that there was significant Jewish influence that could be triggered by the Zionists, both in Washington and in St. Petersburg in Russia. There was the fact that Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish Supreme Court member, and a friend of Woodrow Wilson, was there in Washington, and Louis Brandeis was, in fact, an ardent Zionist. And then the other part was Leon Trotsky in Russia. And it's interesting because the British ambassador to Russia wrote to the Foreign Office that this was nonsense, that Trotsky was not a Zionist and he was opposed to Zionism, blah, blah, blah. And they simply ignored that because they couldn't get past this myth of Jewish influence and the Zionist ability to trigger it. Yeah, there was this arrangement, and Brandeis did talk to Wilson about Zionism. But there's no evidence that he was, he was able to convince Wilson of something that Wilson was already convinced of, okay? And certainly Wilson was going to bring the Americans into the war, Zionism or no Zionism. That it just wasn't really a factor. But the British convinced themselves that they had gotten something from this deal in terms of U.S. intervention.
Thank you all so much. So I have a quick question. Okay, so I have a question for Susan about, I was really intrigued by your closing point on that it's better for Palestinians to claim a right to return while holding on to a nationality as opposed to just doing it as refugees. So I'm curious about why that's the case and whether claiming a nationality impacts anything about their status for Palestinians outside of historic Palestine where they are now. And then the other question sort of related to that is Palestinians, okay, the statehood project right now of the Palestinian Authority, how is that impacted by, kind of a sense of an ongoing Palestinian nationality? Is that sort of Palestinian nationality something like the PLO or the Palestinian Authority can just sort of pick up and reclaim? So I'm just curious about those dynamics. Thank you all for starting the day off so well.
Three very complicated questions. That's okay. But starting out with what difference does it make for Palestinians to claim nationality as opposed to just being refugees or being stateless persons? What I couldn't talk about was the impact of Resolution 194 on the nationality question. Resolution 194 was one of the earliest resolutions after the exodus of the refugees, and is a really critical resolution for a number of reasons. But the most important for your question, Amal, is that it defines the Palestinians to whom the United Nations has an obligation, and a particular obligation is spelled out in that resolution, which is the durable solution starting with the right of return. And who is the population towards which the United Nations has that obligation to enforce that right? And it's not just return, it's restitution and compensation. And that population, as we know from the notes to the UN Secretariat, that population was the entire population of Palestinians whose nationality traces back to the 1924 Lausanne Treaty. So that has an enormous implication for who can claim rights as refugees, rights as Palestinians. In other words, the UN recognized that the entire global population of Palestinians tracing back to that first nationality legislation was entitled, one, to UN protection, and two, to the solutions that the UN had decided was the right resolution of this problem. Now, what that does today is, because all of the negotiations up to this point have been focused on only those refugees who are recognized as UNRWA refugees, and that's a much smaller subset, 5 million of the perhaps more than 11 million global Palestinians who would relate to the 194 definition. Only 5 million of those have been on the table for the negotiations for durable solutions. So this has an enormous impact. And then the other question about whether, what does that have to do with sort of statehood? That's an open question. Under the international human rights treaties, the big debate that has been going on now between the Israelis and the Palestinians about who has the right to return, Israel claims it's only nationals of Israel. So if we, based on the language that doesn't quite support that argument, but if we say that nationals have the right, then it's Palestinian nationals, persons who are connected to that territory, whose international status as nationals was recognized long before the establishment of the State of Israel. And the third question, which has to do with the PA-PLO, a number of years ago, the PA started talking about drafting a nationality law for Palestinians, and there was a lot of pushback because of the sense that the PA, based on the elections, represents no more than 33% of even the Palestinians in the immediate diaspora. So that the pushback was, the PA has no right to draft a nationality law that will affect the nationality status of Palestinians globally. There has been recently a major effort to revive the PLO. There have been two big conferences, one in Istanbul and one in Amman, I think. I can't remember where the other one is. But on the table is this question of a nationality law. This is a very, very pivotal question. And it absolutely belongs to the PLO, does not belong to the PA. And what would be the status of Palestinians who are recognized as nationals of Palestine vis-a-vis their status in other states? Israelis have two citizenships. There's no problem.
Leila?
I just want to ask a follow-up question. Follow-up question to what your presentation, which is the distinction you tried to make, but wasn't very clear to me, between who has the right to self-determination. You made the case that there is something called Palestinian nationality already from a legal point of view, already from the mandate as well as the Treaty of Lausanne. So we have something called Palestinian nationality that implicates everybody who was in Palestine, Jews or Muslims or Christian, whoever, okay? But when it comes to the question of the right to self-determination, you are trying to say that the Israelis could have a right to self-determination today because Israel is created, whereas the Jews do not have a right to self-determination. I just want a clarification on that.
So from a point of view of citizenship and nationality law, the connection for nationality comes from a 1955 very seminal case called Nottebohm, the International Court of Justice, which 1955. And that sort of spells out what is the connection between an individual and a territory that defines nationality. This is a separate question from self-determination. But the issue of nationality has to do with a series of principles or rules or norms. And that is, again, the connection between the individual and the land. Resolution 181 was consistent in that way with international law, in that it recognized that persons who were habitually resident in Palestine, whether Jews or Arabs, at the time of the resolution, could be recognized as nationals of that territory. Again, completely consistent with international law, because there's a principle that when there's a succession of territory, all of the habitual residents of the prior territory are entitled to citizenship in the new territory. And that has to be granted without discrimination. So here's where we have a problem with the Israeli nationality citizenship law. But there is nothing in international law that extends that kind of connection to people who have never been on that territory, never had that connection that might relate back to the prior nationality law of 1924, right? So all Palestinians who were at that time recognized from an international point of view as nationals of that territory retain that nationality till today. But there is no such thing as people who have never had a connection with that land, i.e. Jews everywhere else in the world, to be entitled to a national status. That's the distinction. But 181 was correct in the way that it defined citizenship to the new state. So self-determination is a different question, and again, we have now a huge body of law recognizing Palestinians as people entitled to self-determination, and the mandate was required to preserve that as a matter of the minority treaties, Article 22 of the mandate, and so what the UN was required to do was to maintain the self-determination rights recognized as of that time. And that obligation remains through today. It doesn't extend, it extends to everyone residing in Israel who's entitled to citizenship. It does not extend to anyone who doesn't have that territorial connection.
Hi, I'm David. We go back to the 19th century and Lord Shaftesbury of Britain saying, originating the phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land. It's an evangelical Christian concept, which has become really the basis, I think, for this concept of a Jewish state, and this is in a way the religion of, I think, the modern times. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of the ethno-cultural concept of the state, especially as regards Judaism as a race or as a religion. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the whole intent of Zionism is to conflate the two, to convince both the world and the Jews themselves that Zionism and Judaism are the same thing. But they're really obviously not. Zionism is a political ideology, an exclusive and in my opinion, racist one. And so what Israel is essentially trying to do is to tie a religion, okay, Judaism, to a racist political ideology. And obviously that's got to be corruptive. To the extent that they're successful, they corrupt, and of course this is my opinion, they corrupt the religion. And we know also that when religions attain state power, and this is not just Judaism, that state power tends to be corruptive. You know, we have friends who are Buddhists, and they are always singing the praises of peaceful Buddhism. But you wouldn't want to take any close look at Sri Lanka and what Buddhism's status there and its consequences. And so the same thing with Judaism. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but the point is that tying the religion to a state ideology, particularly a racist one, has to be corruptive of the religion.
If I could just add to that, which I think is self-evident, but the way in which Israel ties Judaism to that nation state is unique in the world. It is not a national faith in the sense that that Costa Rica is a Catholic state. It's a completely different thing. If we criticize the Costa Rican government, if we criticize the Italian government, any nation state that has a national faith, it would never dawn on us to think that we are criticizing the ethnicity with which the religion is associated. But it's by having made the two inexorably tied that Israel has been able to get away with it gets away with, by having made itself into Judaism rather than simply maintaining it as a faith.
Hello, my name is Michel Mshabbek, and I'm the publisher and editor at Interlink Publishing. I'd like to start with a thank you to all of you for being here and for speaking today, and also start with an apology because I don't have a question mark at the end of my statement. About a year ago, I had a friend of mine who worked at the British Library, and he came across a book, and he called me and he said, "You have to come over and read this book." And it was a book that was published in 1940 by J.M.L. Jeffries. It's called Palestine, the Reality. It's the inside story of the Balfour Declaration. I actually took a flight to London and sat in the British Library and read that nearly 800-page book, and I was really just blown away by the amount of detail. And this was a book, as I said, was published by a journalist who lived in Palestine from 1917 to 1938. And when the book was published by Longman in 1940, and the bulk of the shipment of the books went into the warehouse, there was the Blitz, the German Blitz in London. And so only a handful of copies made it out of that warehouse. So I begged my friend before he retired to scan this book for me. And he scanned the book for us, and we just published an edition literally to mark the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And in my view, it's a very, very important document. Just wanted to make you guys aware of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that book available here today?
Yes.
Excellent. So you can check it out on the breaks. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Jeff Spur. I appreciated all three of these very lucid. You can't. These lucid presentations today. And I have a very simple question, I hope, for Susan Akram. Everything was clear as a bell, except you're twice using the term provisions for minority populations, which strikes me as sort of a contradiction, given that the Palestinians were the majority population. So if you just unpack that a little bit and what that signifies. Thank you.
I was only using the reference that many of the British letters and the documents about the relationship between the Zionists and the local Palestinians were using. The Palestinians were called the minority population. The irony is not lost on any of us, I think.
I have one very short, quick question. My name is Cynthia Mansour, a first-generation Palestinian, and I'd like to look at today and forward. And I'd like to ask, how do we address the fact that America is funding all this and has been, and so many Americans are unaware that since 1975, we have actually funded Israel to the point of $1.3 trillion. And I think if that funding wasn't there, we'd kind of be moving a lot quicker. I know we're moving in a positive direction, but what do we do? What can we do about really getting that out there, that it's coming out of the American pocketbook?
Perhaps we could get the last question as well and then have responses so that we can all break after.
Hello, my name is Jana Ramadan. I'm a high school senior at Boston Latin School, and I'm spending my entire year studying Palestine and Israel in the hopes of creating or finding what a solution should look like. But I just had a question because I have found that through my research that there have been some claims that Zionism wasn't always a one state or one nation perspective, and that at some point it had a binational side of it, and that in the end the side that promoted a one-state solution was the one that won, I guess, and created the state of Israel. So how do you think maybe bringing back the people who had supported this binational Zionist movement would maybe change what the conflict looks like right now?
Thank you. Perhaps we can have the answers and last comments before we break. Thank you.
Okay. It's true that there was something called a cultural Zionist orientation, and there was a debate in the 1920s and onward as to how an Israel should be, and there were people who said no, it shouldn't be a state, but it should be a cultural homeland and place where Jews can retreat to. And develop their culture and their religion. That orientation lost, that debate. I would suggest to you that there's a subgroup of Zionists, particularly in the United States, who are known euphemistically as liberal Zionists, and they, if it was put to them, they might try. They might be interested in this alternative concept even today. I don't know how far they would get. So that's my answer to your question. The answer to the other question is to promote an understanding of the way American politics works, okay? This is not a democracy of individuals. This is a democracy of interest groups, all right? So you can tell, but most Americans don't vote. They're not interested in politics particularly, and unless it impacts on their immediate lives. And so what's happened is that people who are interested in what the federal government or the state government can do for them collect together into special interest groups or lobbies. And this is not just for foreign policy, but it's principally for domestic policy. You can say, all right, if you're over 65, join the AARP or something, whatever that is, the American Association of Retired People. If you're a school teacher, join, the school unions and that lobby state and federal governments. If you pack a gun, you can join the NRA. I mean, and there's hundreds of these things, and that's the way our politics work. And so to the extent that a group, one of these types of groups, can finance a campaign and become very important to a politician's reelection or block that reelection or something like that, politicians will pay attention to them. And that's how it works. So, for instance, Palestinian Americans have been trying for decades to create a counter lobby in Washington. It's sort of hosted by the Jerusalem Fund or the Institute for Palestine Studies. And it's a very, very difficult kind of thing to do. And tomorrow, or actually at the end of the day, or sometime, we're going to hear from the U.S. Committee to stop the occupation, and they're involved. There's in Washington, and they try. But that's how it works. And until you can develop the kinds of lobbying that will influence politicians in their policy making, you've got a problem.
So maybe I'll just say a word, plugging law for those of you whose eyes glaze over when anyone talks about international law. I want to make a plug for it because I think in this conflict the law really matters. And the fact that there has been no international legal recognition of a Jewish state matters. And the fact that there is such a thing as Palestinian nationality as a matter of international law going back to 1924 matters. And that this kind of education is really important because that's a tool for persuasion. That's an incredibly powerful tool. And exactly right, it's under attack, but it's up to all of us to educate ourselves and use these tools. Because today, there is a one state of Palestine, Israel. And either it's going to be an apartheid state, or it's going to be a truly democratic state for all the people. That's our job.
I'd like to add that there are fabulous organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, the International Anti-Zionist Jewish Network, any Jewish organization that is anti-Zionist is very important. In a perfect world, it shouldn't make any difference whether they were a Jewish organization or not, but in the world as it is, the fact that they deny Zionism the exploitation of the Jewish issue is pivotal to denying the United States' role in perpetuating this tragedy.
So just a plug for this afternoon's workshops, because they're designed to answer that question. What can we do? I would like to thank our wonderful panelists who launched us into a great start for the conference. Please join me in thanking them.